Hello and welcome everybody to our final episode of the Robot Wars review podcast for the top 100 icons. Nick and Toast and I are now going to move through our 20 to 1 range and then we will wrap it up at last. So on to the teens now. We've got Eruption at 20, Stinger at 19, Mortis, Roadblock, Dan Tom Kia, Terahertz, Cassius, Bigger Brother, Wheelie Big Cheese and Apollo. So let's just talk quickly about Stinger, because you did start mentioning it. I think it's pretty much where it should be. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have it go any higher, considering it only had one really big classic series. But it was such a notable series, I would definitely probably leave Stinger at 19.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much from 12 all the way down to 19. I don't think I'd change anything, honestly. Mortis is the one that had the most arguments from the viewers, which I understand because it's very much an early series machine and did not have a presence after that. And I guess visually, it didn't have as much to remember it by. You're going purely on weapons and its expense rather than the actual look of the machine. Yeah, it was a brushless drive system in 1999. How? That's utterly remarkable. We knew Mortis was advanced, but I think it was until that recent podcast where we realised, oh my god, it was really advanced for 1999. But yeah, I'm still happy with it in top 20. You could definitely see the case for it swapping with Dominator, but I like having Dominator with Wild Thing.
Me too.
Anyway, I guess there's definitely
plus Mortis is a
jump.
tournament winner too. Mortis did win a tournament, so.
I think there's definitely a noticeable jump between Terahertz and Dan Tomkia. I wouldn't necessarily change the order, but when you go from 16 to 15, there's a massive leap. You're jumping a tier. You'd kind of expect, that to be the segue from one video to another, rather than it being halfway through. Because Terahertz was a lot more iconic than Dan Tom Kia. But is Dan Tom Kia still worthy of 16? Probably, yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. It's got the Uta record. It's like the last All-Star from the classic series. It's got a very striking design. I would definitely think Dan Tom Kia is a top 20 icon.
Yeah, I think...
Yeah. So there's only... Go ahead, Nick.
I think, as you say, it is definitely a very notable jump, but once you get to this stage of the list, you're always going to have like sub-tiers within a tier of 10, because there were so many good machines, but then so few very good machines, so few really good machines. And within their own little brackets, it's always notable because they were exposed on the show so much. So you'll always notice the variables between them. But I definitely do think that you have in that bottom area of the teens, you have to represent the early part of the show and respect that. And you also have to respect some high-achieving finishers in general and machines that got merchandise and general exposure on the show. So I think it's a very, very good balance and blend that we have in that area. And then Terahertz starts more consistency and, as you say...
I've got to say, as the resident Roadblock fan, I was amazed by how much support Roadblock had. And even 17... which I thought was a great achievement for Roadblock. Even then, people were saying it should go higher. I could never justify it going higher. Maybe above Dan Tom Kia, but nothing other than that. But I was amazed. People were saying, yep. People like Crash, who was following us along, kept saying, you guys better not do Roadblock too early. You better not do Roadblock too early. And I'm like, yeah, good. This is good. We've tapped into this.
Yeah, he was all in the military vest. He had his guns. He was ready to defend Roadblock until the end of the earth, and just whatever army he was waiting for never arrived.
No, it's terrific, isn't it?
People love Roadblock.
It is. It's terrific.
It's one of the most likable champions.
I do agree with you that I would probably be uncomfortable moving it more than, say, as you say, one higher. But I would never argue if, say, I don't know, all of these people came to my house and crash bashed himself with his guns and everything and forced me to put Roadblock up, I'd be like, yeah, mate, sure. I'd be happy with it. I personally would be uncomfortable, but at the same time, I'd want to put it higher, and if everybody else wanted it, I'd be like, yeah, screw it, put Roadblock 4th.
I remember watching the classic series when I was a kid, like series 3 to 4, and Roadblock was the only robot who I didn't see on the show that I knew who it was.
Yes.
Because it was referenced, whether it was referenced through Beast of Bodmin or series 1 would be referenced in terms of, that. It was in merchandise, even though it had long retired, like guidebooks and stuff. So it's certainly, there was like a presence. It sort of loomed over the show long after it had retired.
I think Jonathan Pierce genuinely mentions it in Series 7 at one point.
Yes. Yes, I think that's
a
right.
A long time afterwards.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure that's right.
Anyway, so the other ones to mention on this list, I was really surprised by how little support I got for Bigger Brother, moving higher than it was. 13's obviously a pretty good finish for Bigger Brother, but the Watch Mojo UK list had Bigger Brother in their top 10, which included House Robots as well, by the way. And yeah, I couldn't get any support. I was hoping to get it around 11 or 12, and I got pushed down to 13, which seems like not a big deal, but this is back when we were very first starting the list, like the first day of the list, and yeah, I was really surprised by that. I thought Bigger Brother carried a lot more weight than that, but I'm not going to complain about a 13 finish. That was pretty good, I thought.
Yeah, I think with Bigger Brother, it has so much of a complete narrative around it, and it's such a perfect general story, always entertaining in its fights, but ultimately, compared to these other high standard visual designs, it always falls short in that area. Like, everything else, it's so good at being a Robot Wars icon app, but visually, that's about its limitation. And it's sad that it comes down to something like that, but when you compare it to Wheelie Big Cheese or the big Apollo shuttle flipper or Pussycat's unique design, I just would feel uncomfortable putting it above them, even though on merit I could see it. But yeah,
you also got to think it is that kind of grey husk design that maybe stopped it from getting a toy or video game appearances. The other counter-argument is because apparently it had a teeny tiny bit of BattleBots merch, which may be the real reason, but I think it's kind of the only one in that group, along with Apollo and Cassius, to not have that going for it. I know it's a small factor, but I think you kind of need that to really contend.
When you're talking about iconic bots, if you get given merchandise, that's got to be a big factor in it, because it means the show thought you were an icon. And that's a big deal. Mm-hmm. We didn't take it into consideration a whole of a lot outside of like Mega Morg's mini bot
and suicidal tendencies.
Even that didn't get mentioned in the script. We didn't even mention Suicidal Tendencies' video game appearance in the script for Suicidal Tendencies.
Put it this way: if I was writing the script, it would have been mentioned.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Anyway, let's move on because we've got to keep going. There's two big elephants in the room to discuss in this segment of 10 before we move on to the top 10. The first being that Eruption's at 20 and Apollo's at 11, and both of them are outside of the top 10. Funnily enough, when I first put together the very first draft top 5, it was Razor, Hypnodisc Chaos 2, Carbide, and Eruption. So Eruption was originally 5th on our list, and then it sort of got dropped down to about 8, and then about 10, and then about 12, and then eventually it got dumped right down to 20. I stand by it. I don't have any regrets. What do you guys think? The jump of 9 certainly is notable between Apollo and Eruption, though.
Yeah, ultimately I think either Apollo is too high or Eruption is too low. It can't just be. It can't be both. Having Apollo at 11th and Eruption in 20th, something's wrong there. But would I move Eruption up or would I move Apollo down? I would absolutely move Apollo down.
So would I. I definitely agree. I'd have Apollo probably where Terahertz is and move Terahertz, Cassius, Bigger Brother, Willy Big Cheese all up one.
Yeah, you know what? Apollo would be the kind of perfect bridge between Terahertz and Dantonkia.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. I'd probably put Eruption, well, not probably, but potentially put it above Stinger, but nothing else.
Oh, yeah. No, I think I could definitely do above Stinger and Mortis now. But it was a good one to open a list with too. When you're splitting hairs about one placement, do you open a list with Eruption or Stinger? I think Eruption was the better one to open a list with, and I would definitely push Apollo down. So then you've got Eruption, Stinger, Mortis, Roadblock, Dantomkia, Apollo. You got 3 champions in the space of about 6.
Yeah, it feels a bit more balanced there, yeah.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
The other elephant in the room is probably the most discussed machine on the list, which is Really Big Cheese. Nick, you can lead us discussions on this one.
Again, there have been a lot of things on this list where I'll very much instantly concede to some strong viewer opinions, but Really Big Cheese, absolutely, I wouldn't move below where it is. Apollo going down in itself would push Really Big Cheese up by 1 more. But no, again, we have to stress this. This list is not purely done on who consistently got to grand finals all the time. It holds its own weight in, say, one-on-one comparisons between very close machines, but Really Big Cheese is very, very striking, very unique, has very, very notable moments, has merchandise, is recognised by so many people. Like, you can just tune into I think it's the United Kingdom casual subreddit or on Twitter and type in Really Big Cheese. You can ask people in public, like one of my sister's friends was asked by her, hey, what machines do you remember off Robot Wars? Instantly he said Razor, Hypnodisc and Really Big Cheese. Like, it's so notable. It's the big massive flipper, and that's ultimately, we'll get to it in the future, but ultimately what kind of slightly hinders Chaos 2 in the fact that it in itself, you have Razor as the massive crusher, Hypnodisc as the massive destructive flywheel, whereas Chaos 2 was, a very efficient and good flipper, but Really Big Cheese was the massive flipper. Yeah. But no, absolutely I'd keep Really Big Cheese in and around the 10 area because it is a Robot Wars icon. It's pretty much one of the definitions of a Robot Wars icon, and
yeah,
I would not move it, not at all.
I'm not gonna add much because I'll jump over to Toast. I'm not gonna add much, but I am gonna say, without any doubt in my mind, I want to make it very clear to our listeners: Really Big Cheese did not make 12th just because of the Axor fight.
No, not at all.
There is so much more to Really Big Cheese than that fight, and I think that there were a few suggestions from a few different commenters that, the Axor fight can't get it all the way up to the top 10. That certainly is a big boost, but there is so much more to Really Big Cheese than that, whether it's like everything Nick said, the design. No one has a design like Really Big Cheese. No one has the power. No one has the tungsten spike wheels.
Yeah, I mean, I even missed out things like the House Robot rivalries that it tried to start. Like, that's the whole idea behind its design, to try and be as good as those massive, chunky, heavyweight House Robots. Like, you have to make something pretty noteworthy and eye-catching to try and compete with them, so...
And it's very easy to remember Really Big Cheese's crap fights, like the Flipper Frenzy and half of what happened in Series 4, but there is so many good fights. Like, the Dominator 2 fight is so disappointing, but I know Alex the Hunter, one of our collaborators, is a huge fan of it. Everything that it did in its Series 5 heat. Its Series 4 fight with Tornado is absolutely sensational.
The Kilotron fight where it chucks a Series 2 grand finalist up into the air and over. It just plays with it. It's absolutely
We didn't
marvelous.
see flips like that.
No.
Sorry, I didn't say I was going to say much. Toast, where would you put Really Big Cheese if we were doing the list today?
God, I would love to have it at 10th. Like, it's it's clearly fighting against Pussycat to get that slot, and we'll get to Pussycat in its own right, but I would have loved for Wheelie Big Cheese to have made that 10, with the reason being, success. We obviously factored in its lack of success in the end to narrowly keep it out of the top 10, and the fact that it retired after Series 5, again, narrowly keeping it out. But going on pure fan recollection, it's potentially a top 5 Robot Wars icon. Everyone mentions it, and it's always totally out of place among those machines that are remembered.
And I'll let you finish, sorry.
But yeah, that can't be denied. You could go and name search Wheelie Big Cheese on Twitter right now, and you'd find more for that than probably some of the other machines in the top 10.
It helps with icons. It helps that it has such a distinctive look and such a distinctive name. If you search Storm 2, who was obviously the comparison, people started to say that, if Wheelie Big Cheese is up there because of the Axor one, Storm 2 needs to be up there because of the Steel Avenger one. Well, no, I don't agree with that, because Storm 2's got more going for it than just that, but also its name is Storm 2 and it's a blue box. Wheelie Big Cheese is it's a hilarious name, and B, it is a giant yellow jaw wedge with red tungsten golf spike wheels. Like, who looks like that? No one.
Yeah.
So that helps you stand out, because casuals, there was this robot, I think it was called Wheelie Big Cheese. Like, you can't mistake it for anything else.
No. And it's very important to note as well that although us three and the entire server that covered this list undertaking as a whole, although we all appreciate and love Wheelie Big Cheese's big moments, none of us are exactly raving fans of the machine itself, and yet we all just unanimously decided, yeah, obviously it has to be right up there. Like, this isn't a bias thing or an agenda that was started by a resident Wheelie Big Cheese fan in the server. We just all acknowledge how important it was to the show as a whole. So, of course, it finishes very, very high in our opinions.
It's funny to mention, I literally have just gone back to the very first message on our Discord chat where I said, hey, you know what would be fun? A definitive top 100. Literally the first robot that I named was Wheelie Big Cheese.
Brilliant. Well, there you go.
What's important? Well, Wheelie Big Cheese would probably end up higher than more powerful flippers, or more successful flippers.
Yeah.
So there you go. That, even to me, who is a huge Robot Wars fan, it is the first robot that I named. So that to me says a lot. Okay.
Yeah, so that'll do for Wheelie Big Cheese.
That'll do for Wheelie Big Cheese.
Do you know what? One final thing I'll chuck on is, for any more doubters who think they're purely on Series 5, I would love to think about where Wheelie Big Cheese would finish on the list only on Series 4. Because you've got, like, Mousetrap in the 80s, who has the same resume, but less. You think that Series 4 Wheelie Big Cheese would probably be contending for 60, 50 above for me.
Mm-hmm. So Steg 2's at the 40s, and that's also a successor to a very popular Series 3 machine with a successive name. So you'd have to imagine, at the very least, it's where Steg 2 is, and I think the design and the name and the Kilotron fight are enough to push it probably into the 50s range, where Big Cheese is right now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a good discussion point. Viewers in the comments, let us know where you think Wheelie Big Cheese is purely on Series 4. Okay, so for our top 10, I think we'll just discuss each one at a time, because they all deserve the respective discussion. So number 10, Pussycat. Toast.
So Pussycat, I think, is it the right decision for it to be above Wheelie Big Cheese? Yeah, just about. I think it's slightly less remembered among the casual fandom, but it's more remembered among the slightly more dedicated fans.
Yeah.
And it did make a good opener in the sense that it won a lot of competitions. It's not a series champion like some of the others. Some machines here were getting reboot editions, which Pussycat didn't. I think its 10th was its maximum and 11th was its lowest, when we're taking Apollo out of the conclusion, out of the equation. But ultimately, I think we made the right choice, and we were certainly rewarded for doing so, weren't we?
Yeah, Nick, do you want to give us some on that?
Yes.
For those who missed it?
It's very much in view on the video itself now, with it being the pinned comment. But Anne Gribble, who was obviously part of the Pussycat team, and the mother of David Gribble, wife of Alan, she was sent the 10-to-1 video and made a comment on just how proud she was of the whole package, how much she is happy of how her machine and her beloved family members are remembered, and she just appreciates everything that people have said in the comments and the general reception of Pussycat over the years. It wasn't just a thing where it was remembered in the moment and so were the team members and then it was forgotten about. No, they've very much been kept in our minds and hearts over many, many, many years, and they'll continue to be because they were such a wholesome, memorable, unique part of the show. And yeah, you can't really discredit that.
I definitely agree, and I definitely think that Anne Gribble comment is really, to me, is our reward for having put it in 10th, and really, to me, just justifies it, because I can't see Dave Young or Roger Plant doing the same sort of thing. And I think that Pussycat just has one of the best stories where you sort of go from the disqualification to almost winning after beating two of the big three, to, you know, winning almost every single side tournament there was to win, then to lose David but still beat Razor, and then to come back with a new team handover, like where you got Extreme 2 with the Gribbles and the Barnwells sort of won, and then the Barnwells doing it in Series 7 and it loses but it still wins the Veterans Tournament.
Exactly.
It's just a great story. There is no story better than Pussycat, except for our number 9 pick, which is Behemoth. Now,
and where do you rank Behemoth?
Behemoth is such a weird one, and I don't want to talk too much about where it would have been without the reboot just yet. We'll come to that at the end. But Behemoth would have definitely been a really high contender, even without the reboot. It is just such a popular, iconic machine. Even back in Series 4, when it was seeded 6th, even though it had only made a heat final, and it was really seeded 6th because Razor was seeded 3rd and they didn't want to highlight the bias of that. It was really like, oh, well, let's just seed everybody who, you know, did well in the first World Championship highly. But yeah, Behemoth was, even back then, it was an icon. It was in Metal Mayhem, it was in almost every tournament in Extreme. It was just everywhere. And to me, that iconic nature combined with the incredible story that hits rock bottom in Series 9 and then hits the top in Series 10 is definitely enough. I wouldn't move it higher than 9th, but it was the perfect 9th place for me.
Yeah, we had a lot of predictions from commenters as it came to the top 10 because everyone knew who was going to be there, was actively encouraging people to make their own top 10s, and as it turns out, 9th place for Behemoth was probably a lot lower than people were anticipating. I don't think I'd necessarily changed that placement, but yeah, we had some calls as high as 3rd and 4th at one point. I wouldn't go that high, but well, it's certainly not going down, clearly. We were right to have it in the top 10 off that alone then.
Yeah. Nick, anything on Behemoth?
Yeah, I absolutely do understand the people who would want to try and push it even higher for their own like personal experiences, because, you know, Behemoth was always there, always bar once, so I understand it. It is synonymous with Robot Wars itself, and it has a great story, as you just said, but I also agree with you that 9th is the limit, and don't get me wrong, that is not a bad limit at all. It's incredibly high, and it's basically the Behemoth place as a whole, really, where it's never going to quite penetrate the upper best machines around, but it's always there and a nuisance and notable and one you take notice of. So ninth, yeah, pretty much.
All right, so Deotor. Now, Deotor is such a fun one to rank. It is so weird, and honestly, I think that 8th, we almost did it a disservice.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. This is probably the biggest regret within the top 10 now, and I wish I put more focus on that at the time because I was busy arguing something else that we'll go over when we get to that part of the top 10. But you know what? Yeah, Deotor slipped under the radar, and 8th was way too low, in my opinion. It's another one of those where it... it's like Wheelie Big Cheese, where other commenters would have had it lower. It was the only one that would recurringly come back as the prediction for not within the top 10. We had like one random call for Deotor in the 70s, amusingly, and then it started to become more commonplace as a prediction when we got to the 30s-ish. Whereas its place in the top 10 was never in doubt, but now that we've got it in 8th, you know what, on that casual recollection of that Wheelie Big Cheese has as a factor, along with the fact it was there as a staple for much longer and thereafter, I would take a total ballsy shout and probably put it in 5th.
I'd probably put it at 4th.
Yeah, maybe.
I'd
either have it in 4th or 5th.
It's not going to break into the top 3, but
No.
I would definitely have it above Panic Attack, Tornado, Carbide, and honestly, I'd probably have it above Firestorm.
Yeah, I would too.
Yep, definitely.
It's kind of that very quirky, awkward wild card bridge between Chaos 2 and Firestorm area, but I think it's kind of a necessity because of what it represents about Robot Wars, that you can be that high on this list for a modest but good battle record overall, but we can still put it that high because of what it represented about Robot Wars in general and why it was so fun. So yeah, it's very ballsy, as it says in the notes for this review podcast. But I agree, it should be 4th or 5th.
And then you look at it compared, obviously, the obvious comparisons to Deotor are Plunderbird and Sachrome-Lot, who are 31 and 36. But I think that Deotor, a large part of it, the fur, honestly, and the win over
absolutely.
Tornado, those are enough. Those two things are enough, and the fact that it won a trophy, I suppose, as well, that isn't like a sportsmanship or a best design trophy that Plunderbird has.
In fact, it went on
Actually,
fire
a combat
virtually
trophy.
every single fight.
Yeah, it caught fire, and the fur, people,
The
even
boggle
in the
eyes.
reboot,
Yeah, there's
even in the
just so
reboot,
much
people
about
were
it.
carrying the fur around, and they brought Deotor back for the reboot.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for Deotor, the reboot wouldn't have even acknowledged the classic series existing. So that is also a huge weight carrier. So yeah, I think that I could justify a gap of 25 to 30 over Plunderbird and Sachrome-Lot. It would be a bit tough, but honestly, I don't think that those two are as memorable as Deotor.
Deotor just knits everything about Robot Wars together as a whole. Like, you have early series representation, fun.
Surprisingly competent.
It's fun,
is the word I
yeah,
would use for
surprisingly
Deotor.
competent. Sportsmanship, it being here, there, and everywhere from the start to the end. Yeah, I do think it's absolutely perfect to be 4th or 5th.
All right, Carbide. Now, this was the very first script that was written by anybody, and that was Toast. Toast, why don't you lead us up on the Carbide
The
discussion?
massive Carbide fan he is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So which,
I think
which
that's another
eruption
thing that
lost
became...
to Carbide is your favourite, Toast?
Yeah, so ignoring that little one, I think it's another one where it becomes so notable to mention that we ordered the top 10 and went backwards rather than the other way around. Carbide was the example script that we used to base everything else off. That's why it was so specific in pointing out the negatives of why it didn't place higher, which then appeared less and less with subsequent scripts. But it was kind of important for Carbide to keep in the end because it's another one of those where the commenters had it absolutely everywhere. Because some people just value the reboot more than others.
Yeah.
Some thought,
Someone had it second.
you have the big reboot success straight after the big three. while others would have it as low as possible to prioritise the classics. And ultimately, I'm glad that we were able to have it above Behemoth to say that yes, it was the most iconic of the reboot. Behemoth definitely counts as that as well. But with respect to Deitor, now would be jumping above it. Yeah, if it falls into 8th, that's comfortable with me.
I think you'll find that Razor is actually the most iconic robot of the reboot.
Well, all right.
It's without a doubt that Carbide was the best reboot champion, and yes, best reboot robot when you consider Behemoth, I suppose, as well. Yeah, that's definitely the correct outcome. When I look at the next 2 or next 3 robots who are above it, would I have it higher than them? It's hard for me to say because I watched the classic series and the reboot about the same amount. When in terms of them watching them when they first went on TV, that is.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to say. I think that, yeah, just if you're in doubt, give the classic series more because there's just more of the classic series. Tornado, Panic Attack, and Firestorm appeared in more of the show than Carbide did purely on numbers. So that's why they're higher. Okay, well, let's start the Tornado v Panic Attack argument, shall we?
Oh boy,
This is
I'll
a
go
big
get my
passion
popcorn.
point. Yeah, this is a big passion point
you know
for
what?
Toast.
You may not need as much popcorn as you think anymore because
Yeah, me too, actually.
this, for me, was probably the hot topic that I kept coming back to whenever we were solidifying the top 10. I couldn't get past the fact that Panic Attack had snuck into the top 5, while, for me, Tornado absolutely should have gone above it. And I still think that to be the case, but clearly we've read the comments and I seem to be somewhat on my own with it. I think it's, again, important to stress that infamy does carry weight in the iconic bots. You know, Panic Attack is absolutely the more liked machine, but the fact that Razor versus Tornado from Series 6 is still discussed, that alone, it keeps it more relevant than Panic Attack, which is just remembered as one that people liked and then it kind of tailed off. I think that Panic Attack for me is the most uncomfortable within the top 5, and Tornado, you can't understate both the good and the bad. And although now I'd say maybe have them both below Deitor, I think Tornado probably is my number 5, while Panic Attack I'd have a bit of a tumble. Seems that I'm outvoted on it, but I still think you've got to consider both sides.
It's funny that you say that because I never felt particularly passionate about Panic Attack over Tornado. I would even say that I like Tornado more as a machine. And I wasn't particularly passionate about having Panic Attack higher myself, but it was just more that I just knew that people really like Panic Attack and people really remember Panic Attack. And I knew that the reaction would be what it was, that people really like Panic Attack and no one was particularly upset about seeing it in the top 5. Would I do it on my list personally? No, I'd probably have it down about 9th. And I would certainly have Tornado and probably Really Big Cheese above it. But I just couldn't deny that Panic Attack to me felt like the natural 5th place because it was a champion, it was a well-liked champion, it was a staple of the show. Even 6 years after its trophy, it was still considered like a heat favourite, and it just was so much there. Kim Davis, you can't go past Kim Davis. He's so much more memorable than Andrew Marchant, and all those sorts of things. So I do think it was the right decision, but it wasn't that I'm particularly passionate for it, so much as that I was aware of what fans saw with Panic Attack. Nick, since you've had absence, why don't you discuss those two and then lead us into Firestorm?
No, I pretty much agree with what you've said there. I think Panic Attack's just worldwide a bit more likeable for the team and machine, and I know Tornado obviously does carry a lot of weight for its infamy, but I think that more carries it into that upper area of the top 10 rather than having the slight edge to go into the top 5. So I would agree that Panic Attack, although I'd probably have it below Deitor now, so it wouldn't be 5th necessarily, I do think it still holds its weight. in that middle area of the top 10. So, Firestorm then. See, this is always a weird one because it was always just on the slight outskirts of the big three in itself. And fourth place in our list of it feels... It isn't erroneous as such. But at the same time, it does make me very slightly uncomfortable because it feels still such a slight awkward bridge to go from Firestorm straight to the top three. Even though it was always on the outside of that, it never threatened that big three in terms of popularity or in the arena accomplishments or sportsmanship or design. So it's a very high standard.
Or even innovation, really.
Yeah. It's a very high standard
to
reach.
No one talks about Firestorm clones, for example.
No, not at all. I think that's the big thing. Firestorm was always very uncontroversial. It didn't have a massive tornado infamy moment. It didn't have a panic attack massive high of winning the title as a charming underdog. That doesn't mean I put it below those two. It just means that it's awkwardly stranded in its own spot where it's hard to move it anywhere, but at the same time, fourth feels very... not even weird, there's not really a word to describe it, but it's just the Firestorm spot wherever you put it, really. Fourth, fifth, sixth, something like that. It's just a Firestorm spot, and it's a very awkward machine to rate within the top 10 itself, because everything else kind of feels like it can be compared in some way. Perhaps Carbide, but even then, Carbide, as was said, has the thing where you can give the edge to the classic series anyway. But Firestorm is very, very unique and very inoffensive, but very notable. So it's a hard one.
Mm-hmm.
I see what you're saying. To me, though, Firestorm is the perfect bridge to the big three. Like, it never beat any of them in battle. It didn't have the same inspiration, all that sort of stuff. But if you're going to find a robot that's just constantly not quite there, Firestorm is your perfect number 4. I would probably actually have Deitor above Firestorm, make Firestorm like open the top 5, and then you've got Deitor as like, here's like an icon that you didn't perhaps expect.
Exactly.
As a bit of an X factor.
Yeah.
But I actually was really happy when, considering the original number 4 was Carbide for a very long time, Firestorm is a much better number 4 than Carbide is. And I like that going straight from Firestorm into the big 3 in terms of, Firestorm never even reached a title fight. It never got to be... it got third all the time. Like, it's just permanently on that podium. And if you consider the big 3 is the podium, Firestorm getting just outside the podium, it's kind of, in my head, seems quite appropriate, and I was quite happy with it.
Yeah, it's a good thing that it was there. I don't necessarily disagree with it. It's just, it doesn't have the true notable individual moment or trophy, which makes it feel a little bit sad when you go straight from it into the big 3, because you realise...
Flip Psycho.
Yeah, but...
It's pretty big.
That in itself... I don't know, it feels kind of sad overall that we have to acknowledge it as the second best to these big 3, whereas everything else we kind of, you can be really massively positive about those big things they achieved.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying.
So it just feels a bit sad rather than erroneous, yeah.
Toast, what's your view?
Yeah, I just kind of wish we could have put a bit more thought into its position at the time, because whenever we came back to the top 10, it was always... me campaigning for Tornado to go higher, or a passing thought to the placement of the lower end. Once Firestorm was put in 4th, it never moved again. Mm-hmm. And I think if we did actually take the time to bring it up, we maybe would have reconsidered. But as a thing to leave in there, it's not the worst thing we could have done.
I don't think it was that big a deal. I think I was pretty happy with it. All right, so now we're on to the big 3. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about the big 3, and I want to acknowledge a couple of comments, not by name, my apologies, but a couple of comments that had some interesting cases. The overwhelming cases that seemed to be, there was a lot of people who agreed with the order, a lot of people who didn't agree but definitely acknowledged the order. The big three never changed. The big three were that order from the very first suggestion. No one disagreed. There was about 12 or 13 of us involved. Everyone agreed on that order. But the main criticism seemed to be that Chaos 2 should have been first or at least second. And I, don't agree with that. And I guess what I will say in defence of Hypnodisc at number 2, I strongly agree. I strongly believe that was the best thing we could have done. When I suggested it, part of me was like, well, you know what? It would just be too easy and too boring to have Razor 1, Chaos 2, Hypnodisc 3. That's like the order you expect. And I said, let's swap Hypnodisc and Chaos 2 round. And then the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the right thing to do. Because Hypnodisc was more consistent. It was more, obviously, more iconic in its fights. And it spawned far more successors and inspirations who would attempt to be the new Hypnodisc. And even when we were writing the scripts, Hypnodisc just kept coming up in other scripts.
Yeah.
And I found that was really spoke volumes. No, you don't mention Chaos 2 offhand unless you're talking about a fight with Chaos 2. But Hypnodisc, it's just whether you're talking about a robot being the new Hypnodisc, or a robot who had to fight Hypnodisc, or a robot who had held up to Hypnodisc, like Berserk 2 did. It got mentions in, I think, about 13 different scripts. And the fact that it just kept coming up as a discussion, whether fighting it was a notable moment or inspiration or anything like that, that to me solidified the idea that Hypnodisc should be number 2. And I stand by that, and I will stand by that pretty much forever. What are you guys' thoughts on the big three?
Yeah, so all three of us, we hold the same opinion. We think it's absolutely Razor, Hypnodisc, Chaos 2. For me, there's always been one factor that stands above the rest, and it's obviously the least quantifiable, but in our lives as Robot Wars fans, we can all remember occasions where we've talked to people who aren't Robot Wars fans, just people who remember it being on TV.
Yep.
And especially, I've had that conversation a lot lately as I've gotten into roboteering in person and started working in a company that sells robots. I've had that same discussion with a number of people in my own work, and when you think about what the casual people remember, there's Dietor and Wheelie Big Cheese coming up a lot, and then obviously, House Robots aside, it's the big three. And of those three, Chaos 2 comes up the least, because you won't even get the robots named by their actual names. For example, you get the one that crushed things, the big spinning one, and the one that chucks things, which sometimes end up being Wheelie Big Cheese instead of Chaos 2.
True.
Yeah, exactly.
And to be honest, I think out of Razor and Hypnodisc, I actually hear about the big spinning one a little more. I have come across Hypnodisc probably more often than Razor, and that's not me saying Hypnodisc should be number 1, because Razor has probably greater value within the more dedicated Robot Wars fandom, you could say, and it's also got international appeal thanks to its BattleBots appearances and general just love within other communities connected to Robot. Everyone can look at Razor and admire that.
Yeah, the peak of
Hypnodisc and Chaos 2 were synonymous with Robot Wars. Razor was synonymous with Robot Combat altogether. But I think we're kind of segueing into justifying Chaos 2 in third. And I can't exactly submit it's the least remembered from random people that I talk to on the street in court. But it's... when you think of big spinners in Robot Wars, it's just the one, it's Hypnodisc. You think of big crushers in Robot Wars, it's Razor. When you think of big flippers, there are other options. Chaos 2 is not the only one that springs to mind, and it was ultimately succeeded. We've got 2 reboot champions in the next episode down that are starting to contend for that. You've got the ones that appeared as Robot Wars' original run went along, especially into Series 7. There's no doubt that Chaos 2 is the most remembered, but I feel it's the one that's brought up the least in isolation. And, you know, there's even the factor of people outside the UK give our country a bad rep for its excess of flippers. You know, I think they'd look more fondly on the likes of Razor and Hypnodisc than Chaos 2. And I think it's just the perfect third place for me.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones where I do understand the people who are trying to argue for Chaos 2 to be 1 or 2 spaces higher, because they more present the argument of it is Robot Wars UK, it is the flipper dominant version and country, and Chaos 2 was the most successful.
The original robot to flip something out of the arena.
Yeah, exactly.
Carry a lot of weight, and it did, and that's why it's third.
Exactly, and that's why I understand the people who will use that argument, because it's valid. You can say Chaos 2 was the UK flipper, and Robot Wars is the flipper show. So I get it, but it just has, to us, that worldwide appeal of the bigger two, and the casual extra little bit of appeal as well just carries more weight, even if Chaos 2 may be a better representation of how Robot Wars is in terms of the dominant weapon type from there all the way to now. But that doesn't mean Chaos 2 itself is still the one you think of when it comes to Robot Wars as a whole. So it's a bit sad, but it's about right still, and I agree, I wouldn't change it.
Something I will say is that, onto your point about weapons, the next highest horizontal spinner on the list after Hypnodisc is Smidsy, or 13
God.
Black. If you don't want to count Smidsy, 13 Black at 42. The next crusher is Suicidal Tendencies at 54. The next rear hinged flipper, there are 5 of them before number 20. And to me, that really does speak a lot of volume. And that's not to dismiss Chaos 2. Chaos 2 is my third favourite machine in Robot Wars. I love it. I love every single fight that it is in. It is terrific. It is entertaining. I could never have Chaos 2 higher than Hypnodisc or Razor. There was one call from Gengar for Smash in the comments that Razor should be third because it's the only one of the big 3 that some people dislike. That was a surprisingly persuasive argument for me. I kind of dug it, but I feel like if we had have done anything other than Razor at number 1, we would have lost a lot of credibility. But I would have almost loved to have put Hypnodisc at number 1 for one of the other suggestors, which was, let's put it at number 1 just so it gets to win something in Robot Wars, which would have been so good.
Yeah, I would have absolutely...
And then you have me, who like...
I would have absolutely been very intrigued to see the reaction to people realising that it was Hypnodisc indeed at number 1. I think everyone would have been excited, absolutely shocked in a way. I know it finished second, so it's not far off anyway, but you don't exactly expect it to be first either. So
no,
it would have been very exciting to see, but I agree, it would have been a little bit of a step too far to not have Razor first overall, so...
Alright, well there's one last thing that I'd like to discuss before we wrap up. We have gone about 3 times over the time limit, so we will be editing this probably into a couple of episodes, but that's alright, we'll take care of that. I would like to discuss what the list would look like without the reboot. So I'm going to list every robot on the list who appeared in the reboot, and we're going to imagine the show ends at Series 7. And I'm going to ask, would they make the list? Would they go up? Would they go down? And I'm going to ask you guys, say up, down, or not on the list. And let's just see what your thoughts are. And people in the comments, let us know yours as well. So the first one, which doesn't really kind of count, is Chronic the Wedgehog. Because a lot of part of its votes came from the fact that it became Apollo and became, all this live stuff. Without the reboot, how does Chronic go?
Yeah, about the same for me.
Yeah, I think it's
jumping up about 20 spaces because there's 20 spaces left to fill. But when we say about the same,
Yeah.
That's
About
factoring
the same
in. We're going
relative.
from a top down to a top 80 for the sake of argument.
Yeah, for Chronic and Ripper, it's more about the live
And
circuit
Tiberius kind of
than
as well.
the reboot. So, yeah, as we say, it doesn't really affect too much in its own right.
So, Terra Turtle.
That would probably disappear.
I would think so too. I think
You
without
think?
Series 8 and 10, the 2 extra fights to really sink in how pitiful it was, I think Terra Turtle... Oh, look, it probably
Extra
goes
3
down.
fights, mate.
It goes... it probably goes down a bit, but obviously there's 20 extra spots. Probably still makes 100. I will say it goes down. Yeah. Alright, Iron Ore. Oof.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so Iron Ore still gets the benefit of the live circuit. It just loses the infamy of its Series 10 campaign. But I really do feel like when we ended up with Iron Ore in the 60s, I think it probably would have done that regardless. Even if we had a Robot Wars reboot that didn't contain Iron Ore 6, I think it'd get there anyway because, you know, the plus side, it was in the reboot, showed itself as the granddaddy of flippers and that it was still around, but then it pissed a lot of people off because they didn't like it because it didn't flip. I think it would have just pretty much finished the same place, even in an Iron Ore 6 free timeline.
Yeah, I mean, we remember its main moment against Bigger Brother, so you don't need to necessarily point out the big negatives as the reason to solidify a high position or a high enough position for it on the list. It always had an interesting design, had an interesting enough team, had some decent fights, and had an amazing fight. So with, those extra spots available as well, it probably does still balance out to what it was, as you say.
Yeah. I'm not going to mention Can Opener much. I think that probably stays about the same. And so does Tough as Nails. We've already said Tough as Nails goes up. Sabretooth, I think we're pretty safe to say that's the biggest victim of no reboot.
Oh, goodbye, lad.
that goes down to top 200. Because
Even that?
by then we've got Series 5 against Evolution and Series 6 against Terahertz, and that's all we ever get of Sabretooth. So probably our biggest victim.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't even say top 200, to be honest.
Yeah. Crushstation, I think, is probably unaffected. But Big Nipper, I would say, is definitely affected and definitely goes down. Without Series 10, Big Nipper takes a big hit.
Oh, absolutely does.
It goes down a lot.
Yeah, we would give it some form of a bit of a mention in the very low regions of the list because of acknowledging how it did outside of the show to some degree. And it still did have a nice design. It still could have gone further in Series 7. So it would have been, again, like Chronic and Ripper type machines where we acknowledge how important it was in the off years, in that transitional phase of UK robotics. But obviously, Series 10 helps it massively. So
It probably ends up about where Grim Reaper ends up, to be honest.
That's what I was going to say. It probably jumps into the new 20 editions alongside the Grim Reaper, probably straight above it.
Well, Thor. I think we're pretty comfortable to say Thor takes about a 70 drop.
yeah, I mean, you kind of already mentioned it when we covered it in its own section of this list, and you know, a modest episode victory and an interesting, shall we say, Series 7 isn't really too much, so it would very much...
Yeah. Would we have
drop.
Cedric Slammer on the list? No, absolutely not. Would we have Thor on the list? Probably not.
Yeah, I think Thor probably makes it with two campaigns and the New Blood, but it would be low. It would probably be lower than Grim Reaper and Big Nipper.
It would be very tight.
Yeah. Storm 2. I'm going to skip Thermidor 2. They're not affected, but Storm 2.
I think Toast summed it up
Thermidor
best.
might actually fall below Exterminator. It was definitely the fact that it became the longest running UK series competitor apart from Behemoth and Razor.
Oh yeah,
may have
true.
helped
That is true,
to
yeah.
solidify that.
Yeah, I think with...
But no higher than one extra jump.
I think with Storm 2, Toast summed it up best at the time when we covered its section, that the reboot gave it virtually equal in terms of positives and negatives. So, yeah, it's going to be... Maybe you could say it could drop 1 or 2 places, because then it just does have 2 series in the Classic Wars. So maybe it will be a bit closer to Typhoon 2, but... You know, it's still very notable for what it did in the arena. Still very well covered by the team and known by hardcore fans outside of the arena. So, not too much of a drop. Maybe a very slight one, but nothing more.
Dan Tom Kia, I would say probably... Dan Tom Kia finished strongly off its classic performance.
Yeah.
And I don't think the reboot hurt it at all. I think eliminating the reboot doesn't help it. It doesn't have any higher to climb, except for what happens by Apollo and Carbide disappearing from the list. So I would say Dantom Kia probably stays the same. If it had broken the UTA record in the reboot, then that would probably have been a factor, but no, nothing to say on that.
To be honest, would I put Dantom Kia if we're getting rid of the reboot? I might put Dantom Kia above Terahertz, so...
Wow, that's the next thing. Terahertz
as well. Yeah.
Terahertz
exactly.
is a big one to discuss. How does Terahertz rank when it is just Series 5, Extreme 2, and Series 6?
I think it's pretty much then in the same boat as Stinger. I'd put it above Stinger, but they both have that wild card factor about them, and they had a high point, but there isn't too much consistency to truly go off of, so... Those two would
Gosh,
be
I just
much
realised how
closer.
big a gap there is between Stegosaurus and Stinger. Oh well. But yes, no, that's a great comparison, and I think that the fact that Terahertz is such an effective axe and did quite well in Extreme 2 as well, and its loss from Series 7 was such a crime, I think that definitely it probably still makes... could it make the top 20? Probably, because Wild Thing and Dominator probably sneak into the 20 now, so I can be at home with it. But I would probably drop Terahertz and Stinger below Wild Thing and Dominator, and that would be where I sat. Because without the Carbide win, and without the Series 10 heat final, and all that sort of stuff, it certainly doesn't help. I think we won't discuss Razor on it, because Razor can't go any higher. But Behemoth is obviously the culmination of this discussion. How the hell do you rank Behemoth without the reboot?
I'd probably put it below Wheelie Big Cheese. I'd maybe put it below Bigger Brother as well. I don't think I'd go lower than that, but...
Really?
Yeah, I think
it's out of the top
I'd put
10,
it below Pussycat for sure. I'd
Yeah.
probably put it below Wheelie Big Cheese, and potentially Bigger Brother.
And Cassius, I'd have it below Cassius as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I'd do that.
Without the reboot, Behemoth's most famous moment is its Series 2 top 8 finish. And, like what, flipping the spider out of the arena? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's definitely the World Championship second place.
Yeah, that's right.
As its pinnacle.
But there's only so far you can carry that, really.
Yeah, I think its successive UK Championship failures in the latter part of its career would kind of just see it more met with a little bit of acceptance to its slight failings, shall we say, in more recent years.
It becomes Panic Attack. It diminishes.
Yeah,
but it doesn't get the big surge
with
at
the
end.
reboot, we kind of had that renewed hope for it again, and then
Exactly.
it managed to do what it did. So, yeah.
But still above Terahertz, above Tom Cure, above
Yes,
Roadblock.
I think it probably goes in
ultimately,
between.
that means it is a top 15 machine.
Yeah.
Probably almost... Well, once you lose Apollo and Carbide, it probably almost... Without Apollo and Carbide, you end up with Wheelie Big Cheese in the 10, Bigger Brother 11, Cassius. So it's 13th, pretty much, at this stage, and that's about right. Well,
okay.
We are finally done. I said to the guys we would try and do this in 2 hours. We have done this in about 3.5.
Never a hope.
So
never a
we've
hope
got
with
some.
us.
Once we started doing 1-by-1 blows of everyone from about 40 onwards, I realised that we were just going to have to sort this out.
Yeah, we just can't help ourselves. But hey, it was fun. I enjoyed it, and I hope you guys, if you made it to the end, thank you.
Yeah,
And I hope
or
you
if you
enjoyed that as well.
or if you say, you know, dropped in at first, then went about your day, travelled home, and came back and turned on your laptop again when you got home, then hopefully you enjoyed the sections
Yeah.
you listened to. Because it will be about that long. Oh boy.
Thank you, everybody, for being part of this project. It was a lot of fun for us. We are already working on the next one, which we will reveal when it's a lot closer to being put out. But let us know your thoughts on the list. As always, we will engage with them because we love getting them. And thank you very much to everybody who supported us in this project. Giving a shout out to everybody who was part of it with us: Luke, Dan, Beeve, Mark, Jack, and obviously all of our voice actors as well, like Cam, Rossetti's Replicas, Vote Saxon, Jim Dramatic, Mr. Psycho. If I missed anybody, Anderson.
The boy Anderson.
Thank you, everybody, for being part of it. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.